Wow, how long ago was the PBS interview?
April
Oh,
this
this
year.
year.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay.
It was for New York, but out in New York, but it was really cool. I was like, I always wanted to be like the historian that was interviewed in a documentary, and I'm like, oh, now I am.
How did PBS reach out to you for that
So
piece?
they were doing the piece on the Thomas Cole historic site, and I had been doing work with Thomas Cole with the Thomas Cole site, and so they were PBS was doing a thing with them, and they were like, oh well, you need to talk to her too. So then they reached out to me that way. Yeah, it was really
Wow.
cool. Yeah,
Well, and so you had to travel out to New York for
I
that?
was living in New York at the time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
So
wow.
I grew up in Southeast Michigan, but I've lived in Wisconsin and New York at the same time.
Hmm.
Well, not like I lived in Wisconsin for 2.5 years. I lived in New York for a year and a half. We moved back to Michigan in May of this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is Thomas Cole?
Thomas Cole was an artist. He's considered the founder of the Hudson River School of Art back in like the 1800s. You're probably familiar with his work and you don't even know it.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, he had a really good eye for capturing like the light and the river and the scenery, but like what I focused in on is like what he didn't include, or if he did include it, like what was like he didn't really include like indigenous folks, but when he would include them, they would be like super miniature, minute little things in his paintings, and you'd be like, okay, so what are we actually talking about here? So it was like kind of I was really into analyzing his art.
Oh, very
But
cool.
yeah. So his studio and home were in Catskill, New York. And then just across which is on the west side of the Hudson River, and then on the east side of the river, literally across, is the home of Frederick Church, who was one of Thomas Cole's students. And he really took the Hudson River School of Painting to the next level. And so it was really his home. If you ever can go to upstate New York and you can go to either Thomas Cole or Frederick Church's house, I would go to Frederick Church's house, which is Olana, because the architecture, the decor, it's so unique and interesting. Like,
Mhm.
and it sits atop of one of the mountains, and so like you can look down and see the valley, and it's really cool.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I I feel like with New York, I tend to be like this. I only think of New York City, but then I
totally.
forget about everything else.
Yeah, New York is deceivingly big, and so like when people are like, "Oh, you lived in New York," I was like, "Not the cool part." Like, like I didn't live in the city, but I would go to the city. We were about 2 hours north of the city, so I would just take the train in, which was really nice and convenient. But yeah, there's so much history the further out of the city you go that yeah, a lot of people do forget that there's a whole other state attached to New York City. And yeah, so everybody forgets about the rest of it.
I'm very, very much guilty of that. Um, Heather, really quick, because
Yeah.
I did start recording.
Okay.
I like to do these just rolling intros.
Totally. Okay, yeah.
And I wanted to just give a proper introduction. Hi, everybody out there. My name is Chris. This is Chee-Tash, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Heather Bruegl. Am I pronouncing that right?
Bruegl.
Bruegl.
Yeah.
Okay. Bruegl. Okay. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Heather, really quick, can you give a brief introduction about yourself and what you do?
Yeah. So my name is Heather. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, first line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. I work as a historian, public historian, lecturer, curator, researcher, consultant, focusing primarily in on Indigenous histories, creating inclusive spaces, creating inclusive curriculums that really weave in Indigenous narratives into places where you may not actually see them. So I kind of just do a little bit of everything.
Mhm. And how long have you been doing this?
Oh gosh, I think actively since 2016.
Okay.
Yeah, it's become more active in the last few years, but I really started doing like public talks in 2016.
Okay. We were just talking to before recording that I know you have some presentations coming up,
Yeah.
and then you do some of them in person, some of them Zoom.
Yeah.
Was that during especially like during the pandemic, lots of Zoom talks, more so than in person?
Definitely lots of Zoom talks. I think what happened during the pandemic is we all had to adapt to creating this new world that we were living in, right? And I think what it did is we all became familiar with Zoom and Teams and Skype and like all of those other devices used to be able to talk to people. And what it did, though, is it made a lot of information more accessible. And so at the start of the pandemic, I was living in Northeast Wisconsin, in a very rural area. And I was able to, people that I had worked with, when I was living in Michigan at the time, beforehand, were reaching out and were saying, hey, we're moving a lot of our stuff to virtual. Would you mind doing virtual talks? And I was like, well, I've never done that before, but yeah, let's give it a try. And so because even though I won't necessarily say we're post-pandemic, but we're slowly starting to come out of it, I like the concept of virtual or hybrid talks because of the accessibility that it gives to people. There are immune compromised people who maybe can't be in large crowds anymore. Well, we want them to still have access to the information. So even though I'm back home in Michigan, if this allows me to present to talks in Washington State, which I did in November, or even back out east in New York and Massachusetts, which I also did, I just think it creates a bigger audience, and it's more inclusive, it's more accessible, and as weird as it was at first, I think I've gotten pretty used to doing talks on Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Has public speaking always come easy for you?
I don't know if it's always come easy, but it hasn't been hard.
Mm-hmm.
I think, my first introduction to public speaking was, I think I was in graduate school. I went to graduate school locally here in Michigan, and we had to do presentations, right? And so, well, actually, I had to do presentations in undergraduate as well, now that I think about it. And I just never really had an issue with getting up in front of people and talking. Like, it was just like, okay, whatever. And then, it's never, I think the first time I did a talk outside of school, like, okay, I'm not getting graded on this, whatever. I think I had a little bit of nerves, and now the nerves only seem to hit when I'm about to do a talk that is big, or the audience is big, or the location is big. And then I'm like, oh, am I really here? It's more of like a, am I really here kind of moment. Like, I'm used to talking in museums and libraries, and now I'm talking on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So it's like,
wow.
Yeah. So it's like that hits me. But I think the minute I start talking, it's just that nervousness and that fear just kind of goes away.
What's the biggest crowd that you've spoken in front of?
The biggest crowd that I've spoken in front of that I think there were actual numbers for was in 2017. No, wait, hold on. I don't know. It was one of the women's marches. It was in Lansing. So it was 2017 or 2018. I can't remember.
Okay.
And I was part of Women's March Michigan at the time, and I opened up that march. And I think it's a good thing I couldn't see. I mean, I could see out into the crowd, but I couldn't really see. And I think it's good because I think there were a few 100,000 people that were there.
Wow.
And I was like, holy crap, I'm glad I didn't know that at the time.
Would that have, if you did know the number, would it have made you a little more anxious or?
I think maybe it would have made me a little anxious. I think that's also really the only time that I had what I was going to say written down verbatim. Usually I just go off notes and I'm kind of not ad-libbing, but I mean, as a historian, I tend to ramble. So it's like I'll see, the notes that I have written and I'll say that, but then I'll end up going in something else. But it was at that Women's March anniversary that I had my speech completely written down. And so I was able to like follow it, which was good because I may have forgotten what I was going to say if I had known.
Yeah, I used to perform in front of audiences. I did stand-up comedy for like a few years, and definitely in the beginning, it was kind of nerve-wracking, and then after you do it for a while, you kind of get just used to it
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah.
Mike.
How do you handle getting heckled? Like, I don't understand.
Oh, yeah. I didn't, not very well.
Okay.
At least I didn't. I wasn't like very quick or witty enough like you see some people. Bill Burr, I think, is a great example of it, who just comes up with things just on the cuff.
On the spot, yeah.
Yeah. I like your style, though, that you said when you do present, you kind of just roll with the punches a little bit.
Yeah.
I like that. I kind of do the same thing. It's kind of what I do with the interviews. Like I have a plan, definitely, and I have questions, but I like kind of going off script a little bit too.
Oh, for sure, totally. Yeah.
Your background, you just mentioned you have a graduate degree, master's degree, is it?
I do, yeah. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and I'm currently working on a doctorate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, what was your master's in?
My master's was in U.S. history. My undergraduate degree was in U.S. history and political science. And my doctorate degree is in First Nations education.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where are you currently doing that doctorate at?
I'm doing it at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay.
Okay.
So it's a really cool program the way it's designed. They really designed it understanding that most of us have full-time jobs and we're working. And so we really only have to be on campus once a month. So once a month I drive to Green Bay and I do the school thing. Mm-hmm. And then, you have tons of work you do in between those class meetings. But yeah, it's pretty cool.
And when you're out there, or you said that you're originally from Wisconsin?
So my family is from Wisconsin. My mom and my dad are from Wisconsin. I lived there from 2019 to 2021, but I was primarily raised in Michigan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
And your family is of, you said, Oneida descent?
Oneida, yeah.
Oneida.
So my mom is Indigenous. My dad is not. But my mom was raised on the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation in Wisconsin, which is right next to the Menominee Reservation. They're about an hour and some change west of Green Bay. So if you use Green Bay as your marking point, if you just go west, you'll run into the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation. The Oneida Reservation is actually the city of Green Bay. So a lot of our reservation land is in Green Bay. And so my mom grew up on the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation. Her dad was Stockbridge-Munsee. My maternal grandfather was Stockbridge-Munsee. My maternal grandmother is Oneida. And so that's where our Oneida bloodline comes in. And then there's the whole complicated history of blood quantum and being enrolled. And that, because of all of that, my brother and my sister and I think majority of my first cousins, were all enrolled in Oneida because we didn't have enough quote, blood to be enrolled in Stockbridge-Munsee. And for those people who don't know, Stockbridge-Munsee are the Mohicans. They're the Mohican people. So I know everyone's like, oh, last of the Mohicans. Nope, we're still around. We're still here. But yeah, so that's how myself, my brother, and sister are enrolled in Oneida, and my mother is enrolled Stockbridge-Munsee.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your mother, did she share this with you like at a very early age about your ancestry, or did it come out like a little bit later in life?
To be quite honest, I don't really recall in my younger years us really talking about our indigeneity or being Indigenous. I think it was something that we inherit, like, and I say we, I'm talking about my brother and my sister and myself, that we inherently knew but didn't maybe have a grasp on. I remember growing up driving, no matter where we were living, driving to Wisconsin in the summertime and visiting the reservation and going to powwow or visiting family, or staying at my uncle's cabin, which is my happy place, and things like that. Later in life, I would probably say high school age, I really started to ask questions and wanting to know more and trying to find out that information.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because I do have notes on this. I was planning on asking you this later, but since it came up now, then reservations.
Yeah.
What is life like on a reservation versus like just here, like in a random city in Michigan? Are there differences, similarities?
So not every reservation is the same. I want to point that out. I feel like a lot of times when people talk about reservations being poverty stricken areas, right, they only ever refer to one reservation. That seems to be the example. But not all reservations are like that. So there are reservations that are located in major metropolitan areas. And, maybe they weren't major metropolitan areas beforehand, but they just, like, city just grew up around them. So, like, Green Bay being one of them, right? And then I know out in, the West Coast, I think, like Tacoma or
That's Washington.
yeah, there's reservation land there. In Oklahoma, like Tulsa is a major city. There's a reservation within that area. And Oklahoma has a very interesting past when it comes to reservations, but it's it varies. Like my experience with reservations have always been one of really strong community building and family and history and just really great places to be. But are there struggles? Absolutely. Reservations were originally created in some of the most desolate parts of the United States. This was supposed to be temporary. They were supposed to be temporary areas for Indigenous people to be on because the policy of the United States was to fix the Indian problem, was to get rid of us in some way, shape, or form, whether that was through wars, boarding schools, assimilation policies, or even death. So reservations were only supposed to be temporary. So that's why I tend to think that's why maybe they were put in the most desolate of areas. But that doesn't mean that you still don't get to know the land and understand the land and how to work it and how to make life survive, right? And so I think the reason that, as Indigenous people, as we're still here, is because our ancestors and our elders found a way to work with whatever land they were put on and kind of made it work and work for the betterment of our people.
And I have this notion, I don't know if a lot of people have this, like a reservation, it's like its own kind of country in a way, or like it has its own laws and it kind of does stuff that it doesn't necessarily have to follow like what the United States does. Is that true in any sense?
So tribal nations are said to be sovereign nations. So federally recognized tribes are sovereign nations. We have our own tribal constitutions, our own court systems, our own laws and ordinances, but we're still under the arm of the federal government. So we're sovereign to an extent, is what I say. And that's my own interpretation of how I view Indigenous nations. But I think what a lot of people don't understand is, like, so for example, the reservation land, we don't actually own that. The deed is held in trust by the federal government. right? And so we have say over what happens on our tribal lands, but we don't actually own our tribal lands. So if my mom were to have a plot of land on the reservation, right, and she were to pass, which we hope doesn't happen for many, many, many more years, that land wouldn't get passed down to me, my brother, or my sister. It stays within that federal trust. So you can't generate like that generational wealth through real estate or anything like that.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because I don't think a lot of people do know that on tribal reservations, we have our own laws and ordinances, and we may pass laws and ordinances that maybe the federal government isn't doing. I know a lot of tribal nations before same-sex marriage was legalized in the United States, a lot of tribal nations were passing their own ordinances, legalizing it in their tribal nation. So we sometimes go against the grain, I guess, so to speak, but it's very different for each tribal nation. But federally recognized tribes are sovereign nations in the fact that we have treaties that have been made with the United States, and treaties can only be made between sovereign entities, right? And so example of a treaty would be like the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution. We still uphold that treaty, right? We still were independent. We held Great Britain to their end of the bargain. They held us to our end of the bargain. The same should be given to tribal nations, and it isn't always. The U.S. has never upheld fully its end of the bargain in a treaty made with a tribal nation. But again, you can only make treaties because they are legally binding contracts with other sovereign entities. So if we weren't ever sovereign, you could never make a treaty with us. So it's a weird, unique relationship that we could spend hours talking about. We could spend hours talking about it because it's really interesting.
No, that sounds like it, and that kind of leads into this next question: is so are there some tribes or nations out there that are not federally recognized,
Yes.
but they still operate as, hey, we are a distinct tribe, we're a distinct nation?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's federally recognized, there's state recognized, and then there's tribal nations that aren't recognized at all.
Oh, wow.
And it's an interesting process, and not all states have state recognized tribes. Like they won't, like it's not an obligation of the state. It's not one of their enumerated powers or whatever. It's a choice that the state makes to do. Like I know that there was just an amendment or a resolution introduced in the state of New York to bring back the state to have them have the authority to recognize state recognized tribes, like to be able to say, oh, we're going to recognize the state. And I don't think it passed. So it's like the state can make that decision of whether they want to do that or not. And then there are tribal nations that aren't recognized at all, but that doesn't make them any less indigenous in my eyes. I'm not the gatekeeper to tribal identity. That's not for me to decide. But it is interesting in how it works and how it sometimes creates a divide within Indian country itself. Who's recognized, who's not recognized, who's indigenous, who's not indigenous. So it gets very complicated and sometimes really messy. And this is not me passing judgment because I understand, how our ways have changed with colonization. But I'm also very much of the opinion it's not for me to decide who does that. My tribal governments take care of that. And nor would I ever want to be in tribal government to ever have to deal with any of that. But like in my eyes, it doesn't make you less indigenous if you're recognized or not recognized at all.
Are there some tribal nations out there who they want to be federally or state recognized, and are there some out there that also they don't want anything to do with it?
Yeah, so I don't know what the exact process is to be state recognized, but I do know to be federally recognized it is a process. There's all this paperwork and everything you have to fill out, and then it goes to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of the Interior. And it's a long process. It's not like you fill out your paperwork, you turn it in, and in a month or so you're recognized. It can take years.
Oh, wow.
So it is a process, and there are tribal nations that are probably going through that process right now. I don't know of any who just say, screw it, we don't want to be recognized at all. But I don't necessarily blame any tribal nation who doesn't, because that's putting a lot of trust in the federal government. And as Indigenous people, and other communities of color, been completely screwed over by the federal government time and time again. So I get that distrust. I know at one point there was a movement in Hawaii for to have the Native Hawaiians to form together to be recognized, by the federal government as, sovereign entities. And then there was another movement saying, no, we don't want that. I get why you don't want it. I mean, I don't think Hawaii should be a state at all. I think Hawaii should be given back to the Native Hawaiians, definitely. And so I get why you want to be recognized, but I also see why you wouldn't.
I was just about to say, there's got to be some, like, what's it called? Like advantages and disadvantages to being recognized or not recognized. And does that kind of play into like decisions that are made?
Yeah, I think so. When you're recognized, there's more access to governmental grants, contracts. There's also the enforcement of your treaty rights and things like that. Not necessarily so much when you're not recognized, but at the same time, if we're really, and again, this is just my opinion, and I think about a lot of things, like just randomly think about them, and I do a lot of thinking out loud. But I'm like, if we're really sovereign, do we need that recognition? You know what I mean? Like, because we know we're sovereign, right? We were given this sovereignty by our Creator, no one else, right? And so we understand that, or I understand that. So it's interesting, but yeah, there are definitely colonial advantages to being recognized.
Okay.
Yeah.
On reservations, as far as education goes, is that something? Is there a difference between like schools, or let me ask you this, I guess first: are there like schools just specifically for people that live on the reservation? Like they have their own school system, elementary, high schools, etc.
Some do. Some tribal nations are large enough that they can operate their own elementary and secondary schools, and even tribal colleges.
Oh, wow.
So some are large enough. Not every. I think there's less than 50 tribal colleges in the United States, but they're all accredited, and you can get 2-year and 4-year degrees there, just like you would go to like Schoolcraft or OCC or any places like that. So they're they're very much tribal colleges and universities that operate just as any other community college or university would operate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those that have that system, are they able to like teach kind of, I guess, like whatever they want to teach without having like the state of Wisconsin or state of Michigan, like having like a certain curriculum that they have to teach?
So I believe, and I'm not 100% sure on this, I think there's more of an incorporation of culture, language, tribal history that is emphasized in the tribal schools. But you also, remember, we're preparing these students to go off into the world, however that may be. So, of course, there are still standards that you have to meet. And I do know a couple of teachers, educators who do teach at tribal schools, and they still have to deal with the same thing, SATs and all of that. Yeah, so it's not completely different. I think there's more freedom to incorporate culture into the tribal school curriculum, but they still got to meet the rest of the standards that other students would have to meet.
Now, another aspect to life on reservations, policing, and how does that work for people living on a reservation? Is there like their own police force versus just like the cities or like the counties police force enforcing law in that area?
Yeah. So tribal reservations, if they are large enough and they have enough funding, and they're able to do so, do have their own police force. Smaller communities, maybe they only have 1 or 2 tribal officers, but they may have a contract or work in conjunction with county police or local state police. But that gets kind of complicated when you look at jurisdiction of tribal nations. Most of the jurisdiction falls under federal jurisdiction. So you would contact your tribal police, Bureau of Indian Affairs Police, FBI, things like that. But then there are 6 states in the United States that have something called Public Law 280, which gives the jurisdiction, which hands over some tribal jurisdiction to states. So it gets a little bit more complicated. Michigan is not one of those. Michigan is not a Public Law 280 state, but like Wisconsin is. And there are 6 other states, or 5 other states that I can't remember off the top of my head. I only know Wisconsin is because I lived there. But sometimes there are, again, there's partnerships maybe with county and state police, but if a tribal nation is able to have their own police force, there's nothing that says that they can't. Yeah.
And I've heard you mention now Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
What exactly is that?
Well, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is it was first under when it was founded under the War Department, which is now the Department of Defense, but it's now under the Department of the Interior. Okay, and so this is just interesting. The Department of Interior deals with fish and wildlife and land, and now you have the Bureau of Indian Affairs under there. So it's like they're putting us in the same category as fish and wildlife and land, which is just something really interesting to think about within itself.
Yeah.
But the Bureau of Indian Affairs was founded to pretty much oversee affairs in Indian country, whether that be boarding schools, whether that be allotments or reservations, keeping track of like blood quantum, tribal roles, who's on a roll, who's not on a roll, things like that. Now, the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs have taken on, they also handle federally recognized tribes. Like if you're submitting those applications, like they kind of look over those as well. Okay. But they kind of are now also overseeing other issues within Indian country. So there's been a lot of work in the last few years regarding the history of boarding schools in this country, Indigenous boarding schools. And so they've been collecting data and information and conducting community town halls to hear stories from boarding school survivors and really gather this information. So there's a lot. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs has kind of evolved over the last, couple centuries, from a department that was really founded almost on the harm of Indigenous people to now that is one that's like, hey, how can we work within Indian country? How can we, help people and make it better and things like that? So it's been a department that has really evolved. And the assistant secretary who oversees the Bureau of Indian Affairs, is actually an Indigenous person, Brian Newland from Michigan. And the Department of the Interior, the Secretary of the Department of Interior is headed by Deb Haaland, who is also Indigenous. So it's pretty cool that we have two Indigenous people in those roles right now.
Is that something like the Bureau of Indian Affairs then? Is that currently located in D.C.?
Yes, the main offices are in D.C.
Okay.
There are BIA offices throughout the country. I once did a training for some museum work in a BIA office in Minneapolis. So they're all over. But the main hub, because the Department of the Interior is located in D.C., so is the BIA.
Okay.
Yep.
You've mentioned a couple things, and I'm like having trouble which way do I go, because I wanted to ask you about all these. I guess blood quantum.
Yeah.
Because I know you mentioned that earlier too.
Yeah.
And is that something similar to, I think I know a big thing now is what are they called, the genealogy tests like 23andMe.
Yeah.
Ancestry.com.
Yeah.
Does blood quantum have to do with that and like tracing your ancestry?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Blood quantum is, so just for notice, I don't know of any tribal nations enrollment department that uses DNA to determine whether or not you're a citizen of that tribe. Because all it's going to tell you is that you're, X percentage Indigenous, right? It doesn't tell you who, though, you are. Mm-hmm. So blood quantum was a concept that really, it's a colonial concept that is really, I think first really talked about, where we see written record of it is in like the 1700s in what was the Virginia colony at the time before Virginia became a state. And it really focused in on, those Virginia laws really focused in on preventing interracial marriage. And so if you were, X amount Black or X amount Indigenous, you couldn't marry, a white person, or and vice versa. So we kind of see it starting to be written down in the 1700s. And then as history moves on, we see this concept develop more fully. And we see it written in treaties in the United States between the U.S. and indigenous nations. And basically, I guess in the most simplest of terms, is what it boils down to is what percentage of your blood is whatever tribe you could be in, right? And so what they did is they started to create these base rolls or base census records. And they, each tribe maybe uses a base roll from a different year. It's really up to that tribal nation. But like everyone who's on that roll, let's say, everyone who's on the 1860 roll for whatever tribe, you are all deemed this amount of blood. Could be full, it could be half, whatever. So then all of those descendants now from that, your percentage is figured out that way. So for me, I am definitely like, if I looked at lineage, I'm like half Indigenous, right? Half, maybe a little bit more. But through family lineage records, we can prove, based on what my grandmother's quantum would be or would have been, she, we can take that and you divide what her quantum is amongst her children. And then you take what theirs is and you divide it amongst what their children is. And so that's where we come in, which is why me, my brother, and my sister couldn't be enrolled in the same tribe that my mom is enrolled in, because the quantum wasn't there. There wasn't enough blood. So the tribe that my mom was enrolled in and the tribe that I'm enrolled in, their requirement is 1/4 of one kind. So even though you might be more, you might be multiple. There are Indigenous people walking around who have multiple, Indigenous blood in their bodies, but if they can't prove the 1/4 of one kind, you can't be enrolled. And so each tribe is different. That's just what mine is. Some go off of just lineal descent. Some go off of a combination of lineal and quantum. Some have a higher quantum, some have a lower quantum. It all varies. It all varies. And I know that there have been tribal nations in the past few years that are really looking at their enrollment policies and looking at population, their tribal population, and like, how can we make this more, how do we need to rework our blood quantum? Do we need to rework our enrollment to make sure that, 100 years from now, our people are still here? So to me, it is a concept that was introduced by the federal government to help perpetuate and commit a slow genocide of Indigenous people, because as long as Indigenous people are here and tribal nations and tribal governments still exist, the federal government still has a treaty obligation to hold up. That can become costly, right? That's funding and things that they would love to free up, right, and use for other things. That's access to tribal lands. And so, but as long as we're still here, they still have to hold up their end of the bargain. So quantum it's a real touchy subject. It's a real sensitive topic, and it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's very complicated.
Yeah. No, it sounds like it. You've mentioned roles. Did you say that that's essentially like a census? Like I've heard of, is like one of the famous ones I've heard of this name, the Dawes.
The Dawes rolls, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that was essentially, like if I think about a census that you fill out, like I get a thing in the mail or something every 10 years, and it asks me some personal information, biographical information. I can't remember what I filled out on it, but it's kind of something similar.
It's something similar, yeah. The Dawes rolls were created during the era of the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act was signed into law in 1887, and so the Dawes Act, also known as the General Allotment Act, what it did is it took reservation land and it divided it amongst male heads of household, and any, quote, surplus land that was left over was sold to non-native people. And so it was kind of breaking up the reservation system, breaking up reservation land, getting rid of Indian land. And so, but in order to get a allotment, you had to be on a tribal roll. You had to be on a roll. And so that's where this formal process of lineage and quantum and being listed as a tribal member or whatever started to come into play.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talking about all this, especially when you mentioned boarding schools, this reminds me of a very famous show that's been going on, Yellowstone.
Yeah.
And there's been two offshoots of it, 1883 and then 1923. My girlfriend and I watched 1883 and 1923.
Yeah.
1923, a big part of the story are these boarding schools. It was actually probably my favorite part of viewing that show. And they aren't nice.
No.
And they aren't portrayed very. And have you seen the shows?
I have. It's my guilty pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm admitting this to all your podcast listeners. They're not the best of shows, but I can't stop watching them.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't believe, like from what you've seen, especially with that 1923 and the boarding school aspect of the show, is that relatively accurate? Do they get some things right about how these people were treated at these boarding schools?
Yeah, boarding schools were places of torture. They were places of torture. My grandparents were in a religious boarding school up in northeast Wisconsin, and from the stories I've been told, their boarding school was not as harsh as some other ones, but I think the portrayals that you get in shows like 1923, or if you're familiar with Reservation Dogs on Hulu, there's an episode in season 3, which is their final season. It's not going to be airing anymore, but it went out in a very, very beautiful way. There's an episode in season 3 that they talk about boarding schools. And the portrayals from, from history we know are pretty accurate. In Canada, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which talked about the treatment of Indigenous children in Canada. They were called residential schools. In the United States, they're called boarding schools. And to listen to the testimony of those students and hear of those survivors and hear about the physical, emotional, or sexual abuse that they endured is absolutely awful. And I know the Department of the Interior here in the United States has gone on like a community tour and been in different areas. One of the stops they made was in Michigan, because there were boarding schools in Michigan too. But listening to stories of those survivors and the descendants of survivors and understanding that trauma that's passed down, like when you learn that your parent or your grandparent or your great-grandparent, was in a boarding school, it helps you understand maybe some of the behavior that you saw from your parent or your grandparent, understanding that there's that disconnect, because so much of the horrors that were committed in boarding schools, those traumas are passed down, whether they're passed down through toxic behaviors or passed down through our DNA, like we carry that generational trauma with us. It's probably one of the most greatest atrocities that the U.S. has ever committed. And the whole point was to assimilate and to deal with, quote, the Indian problem, and to make us more like white and Europeans, and to, get rid of our language and cut our hair and, take our moccasins off and, practice Christianity, and all under the guise of wanting us to be more like Europeans, right? It's a very awful history that, at least in some portrayals that I've seen, have been pretty accurate. I mean, especially, I think almost the religious run boarding schools were worse, because it was all done in the name of God, right? And if you can instill that fear of a Christian God in a child, right? Your priest or your nun is God on earth, right? You're not going to question that. You're going to think it's okay, and you're going to think it's right. And this is to not dog on anyone's religion. I'm very much to each your own. You pray to whatever God, or don't pray to whatever God you want. That's totally fine. But I think the harm that was inflicted on those children is going to be harm that is going to be carried down for generations to come. I mean, the last of the boarding schools in Canada closed in the 90s. That's not that long ago.
Yeah, no.
The last of the boarding schools in the United States closed maybe just prior to that. And so that history is still here, and it's still very much alive. And we still have elders alive today who survived those boarding schools. Wow. So we're not that far removed from that history. And it's like this double-edged sword where you want to collect the stories from those elders that are still alive about the boarding schools, but you also don't want to ask them the questions, because you don't want to bring up that trauma. You want to be respectful of it and understand their pain. And so I would say, when it comes to shows like 1923, from what I could tell and from research that I have done, and I'm pretty sure they had Indigenous consultants on that show as well, which I thought was great. It really portrayed the abuses that you were getting. I was not prepared when I watched the show for the first time to see, it was like all of a sudden I felt like we were going from a scene with Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren, and all of a sudden we were then thrust into a boarding school, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had to pause and walk away for a minute, because I was not mentally prepared for that. And came back, and I was like, it's like I switched. It's like I turned off who I was as an Indigenous person and just put on my historian hat, and I was like, okay. But yeah, those are tough histories, tough histories to have to talk about.
Yeah. But, two more questions in regards to this. How did was there like a particular person, or was it like the federal government that initiated these boarding schools?
Yeah, it was the federal government. So there was an act that was passed in, I think it was 1819, called the Civilization Fund Act. Literally called Civilization Fund Act. And it was passed to help civilize Indigenous people. And part of that was this creation of government or religiously run boarding schools. And so they didn't really, though, take off until the late 1800s, when you hear about like Carlisle in Pennsylvania and Richard Henry Pratt, who ran Carlisle, and the famous, kill the Indian, save the man. And so kind of like mid to late 1800s, it kind of took off. But it's funny enough that the department that was part of making sure funds got out to the boarding schools was the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So they were kind of founded in a modern era to make sure that funds were going out to these boarding schools. So it was definitely a product of the federal government, because at that point, the Indian wars were getting costly, right? It's costing so much. War is costly. No matter who you're fighting, war is costly. And so at one point, they finally decided, you know what? It is cheaper for us to educate them and assimilate them that way than to keep going to war. And so that's when everything started to switch over.
And conversely, was there a particular person or like a particular movement that ended it here in the United States?
I think I'm going to go out on a pretty radical limb here and say that I don't necessarily know that it's actually ended, because we still feel the effects of it, right? So while the schools may have closed down, and even as the schools were closing down, though, there were other things that were happening that were still in works to try to assimilate Native children and take them out of their homes. You had children who were being adopted out into non-Native families. Then you had, and because of that, we had the Indian Child Welfare Act that was passed in 1973 that said, hey, you can't go take an Indian child without telling their parents and without, doing all of that. So I think because we still see the effects of the boarding school era and this era of stolen children, I'm not actually sure that it's ended.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of sad that
it
still feel the effects of it today.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned that act from President Jimmy Carter, the 1973.
ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act, yeah.
Yeah. Have there been, I guess I just don't hear about it like in my lifetime, other presidents doing acts like this. Like, has there been any other significant, I guess, legislation on the level of ICWA that has been passed, like, as of recently, like, Bush, Clinton, Obama, Trump, Biden, anything?
So there has been, the Violence Against Women's Act, VAWA, the reauthorization in 2013 and the reauthorization in 2020 were significant in the fact that it gave a little bit more authority to tribal courts to be able to arrest and prosecute non-Native individuals for crimes committed on the reservation against Native women, right? So it did give a little bit more of that. There was also Savannah's Act, which was passed, which dealt with Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act were also passed and signed into law, and that deals with missing and murdered Indigenous women. Savannah's Act specifically deals with data collection at the federal government level, because we don't have data at the federal level that talks about how many missing and or murdered Indigenous women, two-spirited, trans young men, folks are missing. And the Not Invisible Act works towards creating better communication and between the Department of the Interior, the Department of Justice, and how can we create better ways of intergovernmental communication while also working towards why is there this violence against Indigenous people. And it also formed the Not Invisible Act Commission, which is a commission made up of attorneys, survivors, and families who have lost a family member due to missing and murdered Indigenous women and or people, to come up with recommendations to give the Department of Justice. So those, I think, are pretty significant in terms of that. I know there's legislation that's being introduced. One right now that's being introduced deals with boarding schools and along the lines of creating like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but here in the U.S. And I think, to my knowledge, I'm sure there's more, but I think off the top of my head, that's all I can remember at the moment.
And I wonder, like, how come like it's such a big problem, like you had just mentioned, like people go missing or like violence against Indigenous women. Like, how do we know like why that is such a big issue, or like why it happens so often?
That's a good question. I think it's definitely, it has its roots in colonization, with Indigenous people being viewed as disposable, right? So first and foremost, if you go back and you read the journals of Christopher Columbus, you can see how he wrote about the Indigenous people in the Caribbean and how he wrote about Indigenous women and how Indigenous women were trafficked, right? Not amongst just his men, but, also sent back to Spain and so on and so forth. And what I think we tend to see, I think what tends to happen is when you view a group of people as less than, primarily in this country, I think we tend to view Black and brown folks as less than. It's ingrained. It's institutional at this point. It's as American as apple pie. And I think when we view those communities like that, it's easier to look away or not pay attention or to not care, when someone in that community goes missing, right? Particularly when it comes to Indigenous folks. And it's primarily Indigenous women, but also, our two-spirited folks, our folks from the LGBTQ plus, community, even our men, some men and young boys also go missing. So it's primarily women, but it's all of us. All of us can experience violence in some way, shape, or form. I think because there's lack of funding, there's lack of interest, there's lack of data at the federal level, there's lack of caring and task force and all that, it's easy to see how these Indigenous folks can slip through the cracks and not really care. And it's really interesting because I do a talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And in that talk, I specifically talk about the case of Gabby Petito, who was a non-Native woman who not that long ago went missing, and everybody was looking for her. I remember opening up my that. Instagram, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, like she was everywhere, right? She was everywhere. And what I emphasized to people, I emphasized two things. From the time that Gabby was reported missing until the time that she was tragically found, it was only 8 days. That's 8 days. That's pretty fast. That is pretty fast. Yes, she was found deceased already, and that's really, really sad, but her family got that closure, right? And it was only 8 days. In that same area where Gabby was found, 710 other Indigenous women had been reported missing.
Oh,
And I can guarantee you nobody knows their names.
Mm.
So we have to think about that. Gabby was a young white girl, her life ahead of her, right? And it's absolutely 110% tragic because her life was taken so suddenly and so horrifically. But what about Kimberly Iron or Sarah Stops Pretty Places or Selena Not Afraid, right? We're not talking about those girls who were missing, who may have been found, but their perpetrators are still out there. We know what happened to Gabby, right? We know there's evidence, but nobody else talks about, you know, Hannah Scott or any of these other girls who have gone missing in the same area. I don't understand why we don't talk about it and why it seems to not be such an important issue. And it should be. Everybody should know. We should not be struggling in the Indigenous community. It should not only be known in the Indigenous community. Everybody should know about it. And when one of our young girls or our young men or a member of our Two-Spirited or LGBTQ family goes missing, it should be making the news like every other missing person in the United States. But Black and brown communities always seem to get the short end of the stick.
Yeah, and that's really sad that happens.
Yeah, and that was my soapbox.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. No, that is. I wish it wasn't like that. That's really sad. To switch gears a little bit, and the work that you do. I was reading on your website. You were involved, or you started this initiative called the Forge Project. Is that correct?
I was part of the founding of this organization. I was brought in as a consultant, and then founding director of education for that initiative, which is located in upstate New York.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah. That's actually why I moved to New York.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Connecting the dots.
Yeah.
What did that involve?
That is an initiative that was started to help Indigenous artists, writers, scholars really find a foothold in a world that maybe would seem out of reach to them, bring awareness, bring viability and a chance to be able to get their artwork or writing or what have you out into a world. And so it started with creating a fellowship, which I helped create, awarded to, started with 4, and I think now it's up to 6 Indigenous writers, scholars, academics. However, there was no goal in mind. You didn't have to have a specific project in mind. But as long as you were Indigenous and you needed a space to do your work, we were there to help provide that space and then work with you to put you in contact with galleries or museums or, wherever, to open doors that maybe weren't open for a lot of people, or you didn't know how to get to that point. And so, it was very rewarding to work with and meet some of these artists. And so through that work, I have made a number of great friends and contacts and met people I would have never thought in a million years I would have ever met. Just because of the work that we were doing. And so it was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Today, I know you said you work at the Henry Ford. Are you working on any other initiatives of like the same vein as the Forge Project right now?
Not as big. No, not as big. I work primarily now as a consultant where I am doing work with businesses or cultural institutions or museums that are looking to create spaces of inclusivity to talk about Indigenous history, do exhibits, things like that. So I have a couple of projects going on that'll go on through the next that will start in 2024. One of them is working with a library in upstate New York that wants to expand their Indigenous collection that they have. And they have a great exhibit space. And so they want to put on an exhibit. And so I'll be curating that. And I'm going to be working with a school district that wants to not necessarily rewrite their curriculum, but include Indigenous narratives into their curriculum. So I've taken on a number of smaller projects because I feel like when you can do many smaller projects, you can tend to get the work done, get the good work out there. And my favorite thing to do, though, is connect people with other Indigenous folks that I know who specialize in something and be like, oh, I don't know a lot about that, but I know somebody who does. And that's one of my favorite things to do, is to make these connections and to, bring other Indigenous folks along with me and say, hey, here, how can I put you out into this? And so I guess in a small way, I'm doing some of the work that I originally had started to do with the previous organization, but it's like I'm doing it more the way I want to do it, and more on an individual, personal level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
With these topics that we've discussed today, do you find, is it hard to get the word out there and spread like the messages that you want to spread, or do you receive any sort of like disinterest, like people there's not really like a huge interest in it? Or do you find, are there a lot of folks out there, libraries or other groups or other museums, that they have a real thirst for like this kind of work that you're doing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think for the most part, when it comes to working with institutions, people are hungry. They want the knowledge. They want the information. How can we make this space inclusive? How can we include this? How can we include that? And they want that work. They want to do that hard, internal work that has to get done. Love that. When it comes to public lectures and speaking, people, it's a mixed bag. There are people who want the knowledge, who come up to me afterwards and they're like, I never learned that. Thank you for telling me that. I'm going to go out and tell, who my best friend, and I'm going to read this book. And, because at the end of every lecture, I always put out recommendations like read this or listen to this, podcasts, all that. Mm-hmm. And they're like, I'm going to watch that, or I'm going to listen to that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so great. I'm so excited for you. And then I get other people who just don't want to handle the truth, who can't handle the truth. And that's okay. That's okay. I know what I say is not going to resonate with a lot of people. It's not for everybody. Truth telling is hard. It's very, very hard. And I've gotten pretty good in terms of, I can feel when the mood in the room shifts when I've said something. And so what I've started to do is at the beginning of every talk, I say, you know what, we're going to talk about X subject. And I'm going to tell it to you in a way you probably haven't heard it before. And it's going to make you uncomfortable. And that's okay. It's like, I want to let people know right away, you can feel uncomfortable. That's totally fine. It's totally normal. Then you just sometimes get the people who just don't want anything of it. And you get accused of, revisionist history. And I'm like, well, it's not revisionist. It's what actually happened. And that's actually one of the reasons why I think I gravitate towards history and why I like it, is because facts are facts. You can't change those, right? But some people just can't handle it. And so, I've been accused of like not being patriotic, and I'm like, I think one of the most patriotic things we can do is to question. That's one of the most patriotic things we can do. And so it's always a mixed bag. I'm not ever sure what I'm going to end up walking into.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, that's got to be super challenging. And I do think back to, I was going to ask you this about like my school or my schooling and like going grade school, college.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember really going super in depth into these topics of indigenous people's histories here in the United States. And
Mm-hmm.
is that something that I guess is that something that you found growing up too? And is it an issue in like the, I guess, public schools, private schools here in America?
Yeah, totally. I don't recall ever really, other than like, the making your little paper like turkey hats or whatever at
Oh yeah,
Thanksgiving. Ugh, I
yeah.
don't really ever recall a really decent lecture on Indigenous history when I was growing up. Even in college, I will say, even in college, I don't
Hmm.
remember that. And I do think it's a problem. I
Hmm.
absolutely think it's a problem. I think we have to be able to talk about the truth, and we have to be able to talk about history in a way that is inclusive of those narratives that you don't always get. And we see what's happening now, right, with legislation that's passing in different states, with people, banning, AP African studies, or banning books, or not wanting to talk about, certain things. That is harmful. People are saying, legislators are saying, oh, well, we're doing it to protect children. You're not protecting them. What you're doing is you're setting them up. So later in life, when they learn these things, they are going to be angry that they didn't learn them earlier. And it's not like you're going to sit in a kindergarten class and talk about genocide. You wouldn't do that. You do it age appropriately, right? You do it for what a kindergartner can handle, what a fourth grader can handle, what a high schooler can handle. You do it incrementally so that when they're leaving there, they leave with some sort of well-rounded education. But I think we don't do it because we have a tendency in the United States to not want to face the truth. We just have this absolute problem with wanting to talk about the atrocities that were committed in order to get where we are now. But if we don't talk about those atrocities, those people who died or suffered or who were subject to some really horrible things, their deaths are in vain, and we haven't acknowledged that. And I think that's important. That's absolutely important. I hope one day we can get to a point where we can talk about these histories and talk about these hard truths, and it's not like a me versus them kind of thing. It's hey, you know what, this happened. It's not okay that it happened, but let's acknowledge it, let's learn from it, and let's move forward and not repeat the same thing. Because if we don't learn from it, and I know it's that old cliche, if you don't learn from history, you're bound to repeat it.
Yeah.
But we literally are repeating it right now in this moment. And so I think it's so important to learn that. And plus, I get people that, in their 70s and 80s who come up to me after a talk and they're like, I didn't learn that in school. I'm so mad I didn't learn that. I don't want people in their 70s and 80s to be angry. I want them to live out their golden years and, be happy. Like, we shouldn't be doing this. It's like, it's lying. It's willful lying, and it's something that we have to stop.
Coming up, I know you mentioned earlier too about like other things that you're working on, but is there anything else coming up that you're working on, or any future talks that you're very excited about going into the new year and beyond?
Yeah, so after coming off a very, very busy November, I have a little bit of a break, which is nice. But I do have a couple talks coming up. One for sure I know is in January, and it is with Mountaintop Arboretum in Catskill, New York, and that is virtual. And then I have another one coming up in February for Black History Month. That's actually going to be at the Northville Library, and it's going to be on the Indigenous people's role in the Underground Railroad, which is really cool. That also reminds me I need to add some new research into it that I just came across. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Heather, this has been really great. We're just at over an hour, so I'm going to get you out of here. But before we go, for people who want to get in contact with you, I know earlier we were talking, you have a Twitter, you have an Instagram, you have a website.
Yeah.
Are those like the best ways to get
Those
in contact?
are the best ways to get a hold of me. Instagram, you can just, get into those DMs. I may not see the request right away, but I will get to you. But if you want to email me, the best way is to go to my website and click on there's like a contact me button or whatever. Click on that and it goes right to my email. We can talk about anything, email me about anything. I'm just, looking forward to talking with some folks.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for doing this. This was a really great conversation.
Thank you.
I definitely learned some things talking to you, and hopefully in the future I'd love to do it again.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Yeah. This was awesome. For everybody out there, thank you very much for listening. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.